I never imagined a single foal could change everything. Willow's fight for survival became mine, and in the process, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about love, loss, and what it means to truly let go. But as I stand here, watching the horizon stretch before me, I wonder, was it the foal that needed saving, or was it me all along? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden glow across the land. The air was cool, filled with the crisp scent of damp earth, as I stood at the edge of the barn. My boots sank slightly into the dew-covered grass, and I could hear the faint murmur of birds waking up in the trees. It was one of those mornings that felt like peace was woven into the very fabric of the world. This farm was all I had left. It was a place that had taken root in me long ago, growing into something much more than just soil and timber. Every inch of this land was etched with memories, both good and bad, but mostly good. And when life felt uncertain, I came here. Here, there was no confusion, no frantic rush of the outside world. It was just me, the land, and the animals. Willow, my horse, stood quietly at the fence, her brown eyes watching me as I walked toward the barn. I paused for a moment, leaning on the wooden post, just breathing in the morning air. Willow had been with me for years now, a stray mare that wandered onto the farm when I was just a girl. She was more than just a horse. She was family. I'd saved her from a hard life, and in return, she'd saved me. I reached out to stroke her mane, feeling the softness beneath my fingers. There was something deeply calming about her. She was strong, yet gentle, and in many ways, I felt like we were two halves of the same soul. The world outside could be loud and cruel, but here, in the quiet of the barn, I felt alive, like I was part of something bigger than myself. I looked back at the house, where the windows still glowed with the dim light of early morning. Tessa, my niece, had arrived just yesterday, seeking shelter after her breakup. I hadn't seen her in years, not since she was a teenager running wild with the world, trying to figure herself out. But now she was different. She was broken, in a way that didn't show on the outside. I could see it in her eyes. I didn't ask questions when she arrived, just welcomed her in with open arms. It was the least I could do. I knew what it was like to feel lost. But I also knew that life here on the farm had a way of bringing people back to themselves, if they were willing to let it. The barn door creaked open as I stepped inside. I couldn't help but smile. Willow had always loved the barn. The scent of hay, the feel of the earth beneath her hooves. She was more than just an animal to me. She was part of my heart. I knew that something special was brewing, but what exactly, I wasn't sure yet. I went to the back of the barn where Willow stood, moving restlessly. She kept pacing around, her hooves clacking against the wood. I stopped and watched her for a moment. Something wasn't right. Willow had always been calm, steady. She wasn't acting like herself. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a strange unease crawling up my spine. I stepped forward and touched her gently on the side. She turned her head, her eyes wide with an almost unusual intensity, like she was trying to tell me something. But what? A low whinny echoed from the far corner of the barn, pulling my attention. I glanced over. It was Thunder, the stallion I had kept locked away since the last breeding season. Willow's behavior had always been so calm and predictable, but today, there was a restlessness in her. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I turned back to Willow and whispered softly, "What's wrong, girl?" The barn felt unusually quiet now, the only sound the rhythmic tapping of Willow's hooves on the floor. I reached out to stroke her again, but her movement startled me, her eyes still wide, desperate. I had no idea what was coming, but I could feel it in my bones. The day was quiet, almost too quiet. The air hung heavy with an electric stillness, and I felt a tension in my chest that wouldn't quite go away. Willow's unease from the day before hadn't lifted. If anything, it had deepened. She was pacing again, more frequently now, her usual calm demeanor replaced by restlessness that gnawed at me. I stood by the barn door, watching her from a distance. Thunder was locked in the far pen, his coat a deep, glossy brown. I hadn't let him out with Willow since last season, but today, something made me wonder if I'd made a mistake. Had I been too careful? Was this just nature taking its course? I stepped forward cautiously, my boots crunching on the gravel. Willow's behavior was becoming more erratic by the hour. I could see her muscles tense under her coat, her body shifting in anticipation. It was as if she knew something was coming, something she couldn't control. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the nagging feeling building in the pit of my stomach. Willow wasn't just restless. She was acting like she was about to give birth. I checked my watch, realizing that she had been in this condition for over a day now. I wasn't sure if that was normal, but I had never felt so uneasy in all my years of farming. I ran my hand through my hair and called out for Tessa, who had been helping around the farm since she arrived. Her presence was a quiet comfort, though she hadn't said much since we'd talked the night before. I didn't press her. There were too many layers to her silence, and I knew that pushing wouldn't help. She'd come around when she was ready. Tessa walked toward me from the main house, her face pale under the early morning light. She was wearing one of my old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled up, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked tired, physically, emotionally drained. But there was something else behind her eyes, a restlessness that mirrored Willow's. "Grace, what's wrong with her?" Tessa asked, her voice low, almost apologetic, as if she could sense the growing tension in the air. "I don't know," I said, my voice tight. "She's been acting like this for a while now. I think she's going into labor, but I'm not sure." Tessa walked up to Willow, her gaze softening as she reached out to touch the mare's neck. Willow's head snapped toward her, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she nuzzled Tessa's hand, as if seeking comfort from her. I stood back, watching them. It was strange, but there was something oddly calming about seeing Tessa connect with Willow. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the silence that hung in the air, seeing her in this moment of tenderness almost made me forget the fear gnawing at my insides. The barn was quiet for a while, save for the soft rustling of Willow's movements. Time seemed to slow, and every minute that passed felt heavier, like the weight of what was about to happen was pressing down on me. Then, as if on cue, a sudden sharp whinny pierced the air, and Willow dropped to the ground, her body trembling. I rushed forward instinctively, but Tessa held me back. "Grace," she whispered, her voice a little shaky. "She's in labor." My heart skipped a beat, and a rush of anxiety flooded through me. "I know," I said, trying to steady my breath. "I know, but something doesn't feel right." I knelt down beside Willow, stroking her side gently as she groaned in pain. Her body tensed with each contraction, and I felt a deep sense of helplessness wash over me. I had seen births before, had helped animals through the hardest moments of their lives, but something about this felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. The tension in the barn was unbearable. With one final push, Willow gave birth. The foal slid out of her with a soft thud, and for a moment, everything stood still. I held my breath, waiting for the foal to cry, to move, to prove it was alive. But it didn't. It was still, its tiny body limp and twisted in ways that weren't natural. My stomach churned as I tried to make sense of the sight before me. The foal's legs were bent at odd angles, the hooves malformed, its body weak and frail. It didn't seem to be able to move, to breathe properly. Willow let out a mournful whinny, nudging her baby, her panic rising with each desperate touch. She tried to nudge it to its feet, but the foal's body wouldn't cooperate. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I quickly wiped them away, feeling the weight of helplessness press down on me. "This can't be happening," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Not again. Not now." Tessa stepped forward, her face pale and stricken. She looked at me, her hands trembling as she reached for the foal. "Is it?" She started, but couldn't finish the sentence. The foal's deformities were too much, too painful to say aloud. The foal made a weak noise, a soft gasp that was more of a whimper than a cry. My heart sank, and I turned away, unable to look any longer. The pain of the moment was overwhelming, and I had to fight the urge to run, to escape it. But I stayed. I had to. It wasn't long before Dr. Avery Thompson arrived, his steady presence a small comfort in the storm of emotions swirling around me. He had been my family's veterinarian for years, and I trusted him with my animals as if they were my own children. He crouched beside Willow, examining the foal with practiced hands. He didn't say anything at first, just worked silently, his brow furrowed as he gently moved the foal's legs. Finally, he stood up, wiping his hands on his pants.
Grace, I'm sorry.
This foal, it's not going to make it. My chest constricted. I wanted to scream, to lash out at him for saying the words that I already knew deep down. But I couldn't. I just nodded silently, feeling my legs go weak beneath me. A lump formed in my throat, and I struggled to keep my composure for Willow's sake.
Dr.
Avery's voice softened. There's something wrong with the foal. These deformities. It's not just a bad birth. It's something deeper. It's genetic. My head spun. Genetic? How could this happen? Willow had always been healthy, strong. What had gone wrong? I looked at Tessa, standing a few feet away, her face unreadable. Her silence felt like a thick blanket, stifling and suffocating. She had always been quick to act without thinking, but this felt different. The rest of the day passed in a blur of overwhelming emotions, each minute feeling like an hour. I spent hours sitting in the barn with Willow, trying to comfort her as she struggled to accept the reality of her lost foal. She had stopped pacing, but the sorrow in her eyes was unbearable. It was as if she understood everything that had happened, and that knowledge crushed me. The foal had been buried under the big oak tree by the east fence, the spot where I had buried all the animals I'd lost. I had been there too many times before, yet somehow this felt different. The loss cut deeper, like a wound that hadn't healed from the past. Tessa had gone back inside to the house hours ago, but I hadn't seen her since. The silence between us felt oppressive, and I couldn't figure out how to bridge the gap. She had said so little after Dr. Avery's visit, and her silence gnawed at me. I was sitting beside Willow when I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart skipping when I saw Tessa standing at the barn door. She looked smaller than I remembered, her face pale, her expression guarded. I was thinking about taking a walk, Tessa said, her voice breaking the silence like a pebble dropped in still water. You want to join me? I looked at her for a long moment. She was offering an out, some sort of escape from the uncomfortable quiet between us, but I knew neither of us was ready for that kind of release. I nodded slowly, standing up and brushing the dirt from my pants. Yeah, I said, forcing a small smile. Let's go. We need a break. The walk was slow, and the air between us remained thick with the unspoken. We headed out toward the northern pasture, the same route we used to take when Tessa was a teenager. Back then, she was full of laughter, always running ahead, daring me to catch up. But now, the silence was deafening. We walked in a loose line, side by side but not quite connecting. Every time I glanced at her, I saw the weight of something buried deep inside her. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there, in the way her shoulders hunched and her eyes avoided mine. You know, I began, breaking the silence that felt like it was suffocating me. It's okay to talk about it. About the foal. I know it hurts, but I'm here. Tessa looked at me sharply, her eyes catching mine for a brief moment before she quickly looked away. I don't know how to talk about it, Grace, she said quietly. It's not just the foal. It's everything. I stopped walking, my boots crunching on the gravel, and turned to face her. What do you mean? I'm here, Tessa. You don't have to go through this alone. Tessa's gaze flickered to the horizon, where the sun had begun to dip lower in the sky. The amber light bathed everything in a warm glow, but it didn't reach her eyes. I don't even know where to start, she said. There's so much I haven't told you. My heart squeezed, but I didn't push. I wanted her to talk, but I also knew that Tessa had a way of shutting down when things got too heavy. So I let the silence stretch, hoping she'd break it when she was ready. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I was in a bad place, Grace. Before I came here, I didn't know where else to go. I thought I could handle it, but everything just fell apart. And now I don't even know who I am anymore. The words hung in the air like a confession, raw and exposed. My mind raced to catch up, trying to understand the weight behind her words. I stepped closer to her, the distance between us feeling like miles. Tessa, what do you mean? You don't have to be alone in this. I placed a tentative hand on her shoulder, but she flinched, pulling away slightly. She looked at me, her eyes clouded with pain. I'm not sure what I'm doing anymore, Grace. I've been running from myself for so long that I don't even know where I'm going. I thought I could fix things, but now it feels like everything I touch breaks. Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. I had seen the signs of her inner turmoil, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real, undeniable. My heart ached for her, but at the same time, I was confused. This wasn't just about the foal, it was about something deeper, something I couldn't yet understand. I wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that things would get better if she let herself heal, but I didn't know how. I didn't know how to fix her. I didn't know how to fix me either. We stood there for a long moment, neither of us speaking. The silence felt more comfortable now, as if the weight of her words had cleared the air between us, even though it had left a strange tension in its place. Finally, I sighed, breaking the quiet. Tessa, I don't have all the answers. But I know one thing, you're not alone here. You're family. And family doesn't give up on each other. Tessa met my eyes then, and for the first time in a while, I saw something in her gaze, a flicker of hope, buried deep but unmistakable. She opened her mouth to speak, but the sound of hooves in the distance interrupted her. Both of us turned instinctively toward the barn. Willow had gotten to her feet. She was standing, her head tilted slightly toward the barn door, as if waiting for us to return. She's looking for you, Tessa said softly, a note of concern in her voice. She was right. Willow had never been like this before. There was something urgent in her gaze now, something that hadn't been there earlier. I nodded and turned to head back toward the barn, Tessa following closely behind. The strange weight that had hung between us seemed to dissipate, at least for a moment. We both had a sense that something was coming, something neither of us was prepared for. As we approached the barn, a sharp whinny reached my ears, a sound I hadn't heard since Willow had given birth. It wasn't the distressed cry I had expected, but something softer, more fragile. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. Tessa matched my stride, her expression unreadable, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself, like a dam on the verge of breaking. I glanced over at her briefly, but she didn't meet my eyes. Her silence was thick again, but it didn't matter. My mind was focused entirely on Willow. When we entered the barn, the sight before me stopped me in my tracks. Willow was standing over the foal, nudging it gently with her nose. But the foal wasn't lying still anymore. It was moving. Not much, but enough to signal a spark of life. A wave of relief flooded through me, though I knew the situation was still fragile. The foal's body was weak, its legs still unnaturally bent, but it was alive. It was breathing, albeit slowly, with shaky inhales and exhales that made me hold my breath in turn. Tessa moved toward me, her presence grounding. Is it? She began, trailing off as she knelt down beside me. Her eyes softened as she saw the foal's movements. It's alive, I said softly, my voice trembling. It's going to be okay. But even as I said it, a deep, unnerving doubt settled in my chest. I didn't believe it. I wanted to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still yet to come. Just then Dr. Avery arrived, stepping into the barn with his familiar confident stride, but his face was more somber than usual. He had been the first person to tell me that the foal wasn't going to make it, but here it was, struggling to stand. I see she's up, he said, looking at Willow, then at the foal. His voice was measured, but his brow furrowed in thought. I don't know what's going on, Dr. Avery. I said, stepping closer to him. It doesn't make sense. I thought it was over. But now, look. I gestured toward the foal, who had managed to raise its head, its body trembling with the effort. Dr. Avery's lips tightened, and he crouched down to examine the foal, gently running his fingers over its legs. It's a good sign that she's alive, he said. But that doesn't mean everything's going to be okay. There are still major complications. I felt my stomach twist. What kind of complications?
Dr.
Avery's gaze flickered toward me, and I noticed the edge in his eyes. This wasn't just about physical deformities anymore. He looked like he had seen something I hadn't, something troubling that he wasn't ready to share. It's hard to say right now, he said carefully. But I'll need to keep an eye on her. The deformities aren't the only issue here. There's more to this than just genetics. As Dr. Avery examined the foal further, I stepped away, leaning against the wooden wall of the barn. Tessa remained by my side, her presence somehow reassuring, though I could feel the distance between us growing again. I could tell she wanted to say something, but like me, she was caught between her emotions and the harsh reality of the situation. I couldn't stop looking at the foal. Its tiny body, so fragile and vulnerable, barely holding itself up. Every shaky breath it took seemed to tear at my heart. Grace, Tessa began, her voice tentative. What if we can't fix it? What if this is just how it's meant to be? I swallowed hard, pushing away the lump that had formed in my throat. Her words cut through me. What if she was right? What if I couldn't fix this? But I couldn't let myself think that way. I wouldn't. I had spent too many years of my life fixing things, saving animals, keeping the farm running. I wouldn't give up on this foal, no matter how difficult the road ahead seemed. I have to believe we can, I said quietly. We just need more time. Tessa's silence hung in the air, and I couldn't tell if she believed me or if she was merely trying to make me feel better. I wasn't even sure what I believed anymore. As the day wore on, the foal's condition remained delicate. It tried to stand several times, each time collapsing in exhaustion. Willow remained close, nudging her baby gently, encouraging it with soft whinnies that broke my heart each time I heard them. The bond between them was undeniable. Hours passed, and the barn began to feel like a strange, suffocating space, filled with the weight of uncertainty. The long stretches of silence were punctuated only by the occasional whimper from the foal, Willow's soft, comforting calls, and the quiet murmur of Dr. Avery's voice as he continued to monitor the foal's condition. Tessa and I stayed by the barn, waiting for something, anything, to give us hope. But as the sun set and the evening shadows stretched long across the fields, the inevitable truth began to sink in. We were running out of time.
Dr.
Avery's earlier words echoed in my mind. There's more to this than just genetics. But what did that mean? What else could be wrong with the foal? What were we missing? My thoughts were interrupted when I heard a loud gasp from Tessa. I turned quickly, my heart racing. Grace, she said, her voice trembling.
Look.
The foal had taken another shaky step forward and collapsed again, this time with a gasping breath. Its eyes were wide with panic, and its legs buckled beneath it. I rushed forward instinctively, but before I could reach it, the foal's body went still. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The silence was suffocating. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The barn was a tomb. Then, Willow's mournful whinny broke the silence. The barn was eerily still. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The foal lay there, its tiny body motionless on the ground. Willow's cries echoed in the silent barn, desperate, pained. My heart shattered with each call, each tremor in her voice. Tessa was kneeling beside me, her hands trembling as she reached for the foal, but I held her back. My mind was racing. Was it over? Had the foal really lost its fight so soon? The tiny creature hadn't been able to stand, and now, it wasn't even breathing. I felt numb, like the barn was closing in on me, its walls heavy with failure. No, I whispered to myself. More than anyone. This isn't how it ends.
Dr.
Avery was still by the foal's side, his hands moving swiftly and with precision. But even he looked grim. The panic rising inside me was almost suffocating. This was the moment that would decide whether we lost it all. You need to step back, Grace, Dr. Avery's voice broke through my haze of thoughts, stern but not unkind. I need space to work. Tessa, go get the oxygen mask. Tessa stood, her movements slow, like she wasn't quite sure what to do. Grace, she began, but I was already on my feet, the shock slowly starting to wear off. I turned to her quickly, pressing a hand to her arm. Just do it, Tessa. We can still try. Tessa nodded and rushed off, while Dr. Avery worked quickly to assess the foal's condition. My mind flashed back to all the moments in my life where I had to step in and save the day, whether it was mending a broken fence or healing a sick animal. But this felt different. The stakes were higher. Every second was precious, and my heart pounded as I waited, watching Dr. Avery's every move. Tessa returned with the oxygen mask in her hands, but her face was pale. She was trying to stay strong, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the doubt that mirrored my own. She knelt beside the foal, placing the mask gently over its face, her hands trembling as she did so. I watched, unable to do anything but wait. I don't know, Grace, Tessa whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. I don't know if this is enough. What if it's too late? Her words landed like stones on my chest. She was right to be scared. The foal's body was limp. There was nothing but the rise and fall of its chest, shallow breaths that didn't seem to have enough strength. It felt as though time itself had stopped, and with each second, my hope was draining away. But I refused to give up. I couldn't. I wouldn't let it happen. No, I said again, more firmly this time. We can't give up now. Not when she's still breathing. There's a chance. Tessa's lips trembled, and I could see her wanting to believe me but struggling to do so. I understood. This wasn't just about the foal, it was about everything we'd been through. The struggles, the losses, the pieces of our hearts we had buried over the years. But we couldn't afford to fall apart now, not when Willow and her foal needed us. Minutes passed, long, agonizing minutes, before Dr. Avery lifted his head, his expression unreadable. I held my breath, every fiber of my being tense with the fear that we'd lost our chance. And then he spoke. There's a heartbeat. A weak one, but it's there. A tiny flicker of hope ignited in me. I dared to take a deep breath, still wary but beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, we weren't too late. Dr. Avery continued to work, monitoring the foal's vitals and administering the oxygen mask carefully. Tessa and I stayed close, barely daring to speak. We watched as the foal's shallow breath slowly deepened, its body beginning to move just a little bit. I couldn't help but let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The foal wasn't out of danger, but it wasn't gone either. There was hope. As the hours stretched on, I refused to leave. I stayed by Willow's side, rubbing her neck and whispering to her, telling her we'd get through this. Tessa had retreated to the corner of the barn, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, still shaken. But her eyes were on the foal now, filled with that same fragile hope that I had. We didn't speak much, but I knew we were both fighting the same battle, each of us trying to keep our heads above water as the foal fought for its life. The barn grew darker as evening settled in, and the soft glow of the lanterns cast long shadows on the hay. The foal's breathing became steadier. It was small, but it was enough to give us a flicker of faith. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something. I couldn't tell if it was victory or defeat. But I refused to back down.
Not now.
We're going to make it, I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Tessa came over then, her face softer now, though still lined with worry. She didn't say anything, just knelt beside me. And I could feel the weight of her quiet support. Her words earlier, her doubts, still lingered in the back of my mind. But here, in this moment, it was clear. She wasn't going anywhere. We were in this together. And somehow, that was enough. As the night wore on, we stayed by the foal's side, both of us exhausted but unwilling to leave. The barn was still, save for the occasional rustle of hay and the soft breaths from Willow and her foal. It felt like we were in a world suspended in time. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge that the situation was still fragile, but the slight improvement in the foal's breathing was undeniable. It was enough to fuel the quiet hope that lingered in the barn air. I kept my eyes on the foal, watching as it shifted slightly, its legs trembling as it attempted to lift its head. The action, though small, was a breakthrough. It was the first time in hours that it had shown any movement of its own accord. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't help but reach out to touch the foal's soft coat, running my hand over its back, feeling its fragile warmth. Tessa, too, was watching closely. I glanced over at her, catching the tear that slipped down her cheek. But her lips curved into the smallest, most fragile smile, and it gave me the strength I didn't know I still had. "We might just make it," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. Tessa nodded, though the quiet doubt still lingered in her eyes. "It's not over yet, but this is a start." The hours dragged on, and as I sat in the dim light of the barn, I found myself lost in thought. I couldn't help but reflect on all the times in my life when I had fought for something, when I had struggled against the odds. From the first time I cared for an animal that seemed destined to die, to the many sleepless nights spent tending to the farm, each one had been a test of my resolve. I thought back to the moment I first set foot on this farm. I was young, too young, some would say, and yet there was something in me that refused to give up. My father had always told me that if I wanted to survive here, I'd have to fight for it. Fight for the land, for the animals, for my place in the world. But as I looked at the foal, so small and fragile, I realized that fighting wasn't always about strength. Sometimes it was about patience, perseverance, love. I remembered the one thing my father had never told me: how to let go. The one thing I still struggled with was accepting that there were some things I couldn't control. Tessa shifted beside me, bringing me back to the present. She had been quieter than usual, and I could tell she was thinking deeply, processing her own emotions. It wasn't like Tessa to be silent for so long, but I understood. This whole situation was more than just about the foal. It was about everything else that had been left unsaid. We had spent so many years tiptoeing around each other, building walls between us, never truly letting each other in. But in this moment, sitting in the barn, surrounded by the sounds of life and death, those walls seemed less important. I turned to her, ready to speak, but she beat me to it. "Grace,
I'm sorry.
I didn't mean to doubt you earlier. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to lose anyone else." The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had never realized just how deeply Tessa's own pain had shaped her. She had lost so much already, and I had been too wrapped up in my own fears to see it. I took her hand, holding it gently, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we didn't need words to communicate. We both understood. We had been fighting in our own ways, and maybe now we could fight together. "We're in this together," I whispered, squeezing her hand. Tessa nodded, her eyes softening. "Yeah, together." As dawn began to break, the barn's quiet, heavy atmosphere seemed to shift. The foal had continued to breathe steadily, but its body was still weak, trembling with every movement. It wasn't out of the woods yet. Just when I thought we were out of the danger zone, the foal began to gasp again, its small body jerking with the effort to breathe. I jumped to my feet, my heart leaping into my throat.
No, no, no.
I cried, rushing over to the foal's side. Tessa was beside me in an instant, her face pale with fear.
Dr.
Avery had warned us that complications could arise at any time, but this felt like the end. I watched as the foal's tiny body struggled, its breath shallow and erratic. Willow nudged her baby with desperation, her soft whinnies growing more frantic. It felt like a cruel joke. Just when we thought there was hope, the foal seemed to be slipping away again. Tessa put a hand on my arm, her voice trembling. "What now? What can we do?" I shook my head, unable to answer. I had no idea what else we could do. We had tried everything. Had we waited too long? Had it been too much for the foal? Just as I was about to lose hope completely, Dr. Avery arrived again, his presence steady and reassuring. He knelt beside the foal, his hands working quickly, his face focused with a calm intensity that I could never muster. "Stay calm, Grace. I need you to help me," he said in a low, controlled voice. "Tessa, hold the foal's head steady." Tessa did as she was told, and for the next several minutes, Dr. Avery worked tirelessly. He administered a shot, then adjusted the oxygen mask again, while I stood, holding my breath and praying that the foal would hold on. Finally, after what felt like hours, the foal gave a small, but steady, exhale. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. "It's going to be okay, Dr. Avery said, his voice soft but confident. I exhaled in relief, a weight lifting off my chest that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The foal wasn't out of danger, but for the first time, I felt like there was a real chance for survival. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Tessa and I sat side by side, watching the foal rest. We didn't speak for a long time, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I realized then that this fight wasn't just for the foal. It was for us, too. For everything we had been through, and for everything we had yet to face. The foal was a symbol of something bigger, a lesson that patience, perseverance, and love could overcome even the darkest moments. I glanced at Tessa, and for the first time, I felt like we truly understood each other. "We'll get through this," I said, my voice firm but soft.
Together.
Tessa smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet kind of resolve. "Yeah, together." The barn was quieter now. The chaos of the previous night had finally given way to a more peaceful, tentative calm. The foal, though still weak, was showing signs of improvement. It had managed to stand for a few seconds earlier, its legs shaky beneath it, but it had stayed upright. That was a victory. I watched it closely, the little creature lying beside Willow, who seemed more protective than ever. The mother nuzzled the foal gently, her warm breath caressing its tiny body. The sight of them together, so vulnerable, yet so full of life, stirred something deep inside me. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was a possibility for light to shine through. Tessa was sitting on the wooden crate by the door, her eyes never leaving the foal. She had been quiet all morning, her usual talkative self subdued in the face of everything that had happened. I could see the battle in her, the doubt, the fear, and yet the flickering ember of hope that she was trying so hard to keep alive. I approached her slowly, not wanting to break the fragile moment. "I never thought I'd see it through," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I sat down beside her, not needing to say anything in reply. The truth was I hadn't believed it either. There had been so many times when I thought we were too late, too far gone. But now, watching the foal breathe, I realized something important. We had made it. We weren't out of the woods yet, but we had given the foal a fighting chance. "Me neither," I said quietly. "But we're here now, and we're not giving up." It was strange how quickly the responsibility of caring for the foal had settled into my bones. The urgency that had driven me the night before was still there, but now it was tempered with a new kind of responsibility, the kind that comes with knowing you have to nurture, not just fix. The foal wasn't an emergency to be solved. It was a life to be cared for. I thought of the other animals on the farm, our horses, the cattle, the chickens. They all relied on me in different ways, but none more so than the foal. This was different. I had been given a second chance to make things right. Tessa and I had spent hours throughout the morning making sure the foal was comfortable. We checked its vitals, administered small doses of nutrients to help it regain its strength, and kept Willow close. The bond between them was undeniable, and the foal seemed to draw comfort from its mother's presence. There was no doubt in my mind now. This foal would survive, given the right care. As the afternoon wore on, Tessa broke the silence again, her voice a little stronger now. "Grace," she began, her words laced with an unexpected vulnerability. "I've been thinking about what happened last night." I turned to her, raising an eyebrow. The weight of her words hung in the air, and I could feel that she was on the verge of saying something important. "I was scared, Grace. Really scared. I thought we were going to lose the foal, but I was also scared of losing you too. And I didn't know what to do with that fear." Her confession caught me off guard. I had known Tessa for so long, and I had always thought she was the stronger of the two of us. She had this way of masking her emotions, pretending that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. To hear her admit her fear was a revelation. I reached out and placed my hand on hers, squeezing it gently. "I understand, Tessa. I'm scared too, but we're both still here. And we've been through so much already." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know how to ask for help, Grace, but I need you." My heart ached for her. I had always been the one who was afraid to ask for help, to lean on others. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for us to stop carrying all the weight alone. "You have me, Tessa. Always," I said, my voice full of conviction. "We're in this together." The moment I didn't think would come, the one that felt like an impossible dream, finally happened. The foal took its first steps. Slowly, shakily, but it was moving. I watched in awe as it tottered, its legs wobbly and unsure, but its eyes were focused on Willow, and with each step, it grew stronger. The barn was filled with the sound of Willow's soft whinnies and the foal's clumsy steps. Tessa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and I could see the tears shining in her eyes again. This time, though, they weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of relief, of hope. The foal had survived. Against all odds, it had made it. Tessa turned to me, her face beaming, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were both finally living in the moment. Even though the foal had taken its first steps, I knew that this was just the beginning. We still had a long road ahead of us. The foal needed time to gain strength to grow. But for the first time in days, I allowed myself to believe that we could do this, that we could give this foal the life it deserved. But more than that, I realized how much Tessa and I had learned. We had both been carrying too much on our own, too much grief, too much fear, too many walls. But now, for the first time in years, we had found a way to share that burden. And it wasn't just about the foal anymore. It was about us. The days following the foal's first steps were full of cautious optimism. We spent every moment we could tending to its needs. The foal still wasn't fully strong, and every hour felt like a new test. It would take a few more days before it could move with confidence, but we saw progress with every small action. It would stagger to its feet in the mornings, its legs still shaky, but it always managed to stand on its own, determined, no matter how much it faltered. I kept thinking back to the fear in Tessa's eyes during those first moments when the foal had been so fragile, when we didn't know if it would survive. I couldn't stop thinking about how we had come so close to losing it, how close we had come to losing each other. Tessa and I had spent countless hours side by side, tending to the foal and checking on Willow. Sometimes she'd talk about small things, like the weather or how the land looked in the early mornings when the fog rolled in. Other times, she was silent, lost in her own thoughts, her gaze lingering on the foal or the horizon. For me, these moments were bittersweet. I kept wondering if Tessa and I were really mending the rift that had formed between us over the years, or if we were just going through the motions. But in those small silences, those shared moments of care, I realized something important. We were healing, even if it wasn't as quickly as I had hoped. As I sat in the hayloft one evening, staring down at the foal nestled between Willow's legs, I couldn't escape the feeling of guilt that lingered just beneath the surface. I had told myself over and over that I was doing everything right. But a part of me kept wondering, did I wait too long? Did I take too much time deciding whether to intervene with the foal's health? What if I had acted sooner? What if we had lost the foal because I had hesitated? Tessa's words from earlier rang in my ears. I didn't want to lose anyone else. I had heard them, but I hadn't truly understood them until now. Tessa and I were both haunted by the ghosts of our past, of things we had lost, of choices we hadn't made. And I realized that those ghosts had a way of making us second-guess everything, even the things we thought we had under control. But maybe that's the point. Maybe living, really living, was about accepting the uncertainty. Accepting that you couldn't always know the outcome. The guilt I was feeling wasn't about failure, it was about wanting to do better, to be better. Still, I couldn't help but ask myself, what if it was too late? What if the foal couldn't keep fighting? Tessa was standing outside the barn, watching the sun dip below the horizon. She had been quiet all afternoon, and I knew she was struggling with her own doubts. I walked up to her, careful not to startle her. "What's on your mind?" I asked, keeping my voice low, respectful of the space she needed. She turned to me, her face soft but with a look of uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't know, Grace. Sometimes it feels like we're not doing enough. Like there's still something missing, and it's just not going to be enough for the foal." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized that Tessa was doubting herself, too. It had always seemed like she was the strong one, the one who believed we could push through anything. But now, I saw the vulnerability beneath that strength, the cracks in her resolve that I hadn't noticed before. "We're doing everything we can," I said, my voice softer than I meant it to be. "You're doing everything you can. We just have to keep going." "I know," she replied, but the doubt in her voice was still there, lingering like a shadow. "But I don't want to be the one who lets everyone down. I can't lose anything else." I understood what she was saying. Her fear was the same as mine, that we would try, and still fall short. That we would keep hoping, and in the end, the foal would be gone just like so many things before it. But this was different. The foal was different. This was a fight that mattered, a fight that we both believed in. I placed my hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the same way she had grounded me so many times. "We're not going to lose it. Not this time," I said firmly, even though I wasn't sure of the truth of my words. I needed her to believe in this as much as I did. We both needed to. The foal's recovery didn't come easily. We were still very much in a dangerous place, but there was a glimmer of hope. Every day, we saw the foal gain a little more strength. By midweek, it was standing on its own for longer periods. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. And that was enough. Tessa and I spent hours with the foal and Willow, making sure the foal's nourishment was consistent, giving it small walks to help it build strength. Every step it took felt like a victory. It was no longer just about survival, it was about growth. And growth, I realized, didn't always happen in straight lines. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, but the only thing that mattered was that we kept moving forward. One afternoon, as we watched the foal stand on its own, I realized something that I hadn't fully understood until that moment. Patience wasn't just about waiting for things to get better, it was about trusting that things would get better if we stayed committed. If we kept showing up, day after day, despite how tired we were or how uncertain the outcome seemed. Patience was about believing in the process. I turned to Tessa, who was sitting beside me, her eyes focused on the foal. "You know," I said, my voice steady now, "I think we're going to make it." Tessa looked at me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a light in her eyes, a spark of hope that had been buried under the weight of everything we had been through. "I think so too," she said softly, a small but genuine smile curling on her lips. "I think so too." The barn was quieter now, but the silence felt heavier. The foal had made more progress in the last few days than I thought possible. It could walk steadily for a few minutes at a time, its legs no longer wobbling uncontrollably beneath it. It was a beautiful sight, one that made my chest tighten with a mix of relief and disbelief. But beneath the quiet, there was still tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst wasn't over yet. Even though the foal had made it this far, the road ahead was uncertain. Nothing about this felt guaranteed. Tessa and I had been careful not to get too hopeful, not to let ourselves believe in a happily ever after too soon. But that day, something felt different. As I watched Tessa tending to Willow, Checking her water and feed, I noticed the look in her eyes. It was the same look she had worn when she first agreed to help me with the foal. The look of determination, the quiet promise that she would not let it fail, no matter what. Tessa caught me staring and gave me a small, almost imperceptible smile. She didn't say anything, she didn't need to. I could see the unspoken trust between us, the way we had learned to lean on each other, even in the darkest moments. It was a fragile thing, but it was real. I stepped outside the barn and leaned against the old fence post, taking in the fresh air. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what. I just had a sense that the foal's recovery wasn't the end of our struggle. It was a sign that we had battled our way through the worst, but a new challenge was on the horizon. I hadn't told Tessa about my growing fears. How could I? She was so wrapped up in the care of the foal, so focused on making sure everything was perfect, that I didn't want to bring up the possibility that it might all fall apart. But deep down, I couldn't shake the worry that it was too early to celebrate. The foal was fragile still. The slightest misstep, the smallest change in its health, could undo everything we'd worked so hard for. And I wasn't sure if we could handle that kind of heartbreak again. I was afraid of what would happen if we lost the foal. But more than that, I was afraid of what it would mean for us, for me and Tessa. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Tessa talking to Willow in soft, gentle tones. The barn was bathed in the warm glow of early sunlight, and the foal was lying on the hay, its legs tucked beneath it, breathing deeply. Everything seemed peaceful, but the air was still thick with the tension that had settled in my chest. Tessa turned to me as I walked in, a serious look on her face. "Grace," she began, her voice steady, but heavy with something unspoken, "we need to talk." My heart skipped a beat. I had known this moment was coming. The quiet, the normalcy. It couldn't last forever. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. I didn't want to sound panicked, but I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me. "I've been thinking," she said, her hands resting on Willow's back as she spoke, "about what comes next. The foal. It's not out of danger yet. We've made a lot of progress, but there's still so much we don't know. And it's not just about the foal. It's about this farm. About us." I felt the air shift between us. The farm had always been more than just a place for us to work. It was where we built our lives, where we tried to make sense of everything that had happened to us. But now, it felt like the weight of the past was crashing down again. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. I had an inkling of where this was going, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. "I've been thinking about leaving," she said, and the words hit me like a slap to the face. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I blinked, trying to process what she had said. Leave? Leave the farm? Leave everything we had worked for? Leave? I echoed, my voice hoarse. "I think it's time to go," she said quietly, her eyes looking down at the floor as if she couldn't face me directly. "I've been holding on to this place for so long, but maybe it's time to let it go." I stood there, stunned, as the weight of her words sank in. I could feel my mind racing, the familiar panic rising within me. Tessa had always been my anchor. We had been through so much together, and now she was telling me she might leave. "Tessa, we've been through so much," I said, my voice shaky. "We've worked together, fought together. We can't just give up now." "I'm not giving up," she replied quickly, but there was a sadness in her voice that cut through me. I need to find something else. A different path, maybe. I don't know. But I think we both need space to figure out who we are, what we really want." Her words hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just about the farm. It was about us, about everything we had been struggling with beneath the surface. The things we hadn't said. The pieces of ourselves we had kept hidden from each other. I didn't know how to respond. The world felt like it was tilting on its axis, and for a moment, I couldn't even see clearly. I couldn't imagine the farm without Tessa, without the way we had built our lives together. But I also understood what she was saying. She was looking for something more, something different. I had been, too, but I hadn't known how to express it. Tessa wasn't just talking about leaving the farm. She was talking about leaving everything we had built, leaving the person who had been there through all of it. Is this really what you want? I asked quietly. To leave? She hesitated, her gaze shifting from the foal to the barn door. I don't know, but I think I have to find out. And there it was, the moment that would determine everything. Our relationship had been built on trust, on knowing that we would fight for each other, no matter the cost. But now it felt like we were at a crossroads. Could we really let go of everything and walk away from it all? Could we trust each other to take the next step, together, without being afraid of the unknown? I didn't know the answers. But in that moment, I realized that the real test wasn't the foal or the farm. It was whether we could trust ourselves and each other, enough to face the future, no matter what it held. It had been a week since Tessa's confession. A week filled with moments of uncertainty, where the weight of the future pressed heavily on both of us. The foal was stronger now, more stable. It could walk longer distances, no longer wobbling in exhaustion after just a few steps. Willow had made a full recovery as well, and it felt like things were finally settling into a kind of rhythm. But in the midst of this, Tessa's decisions still lingered like an unspoken shadow between us. I spent most of my time in the barn now, cleaning, feeding, checking on the animals, keeping myself busy, trying not to overthink everything. The farm needed me, and in a way, it felt like the farm was the one thing I had control over. But I couldn't ignore the fact that my heart was divided. Tessa hadn't left yet, and part of me kept hoping that she would stay, that we would figure this out together. But the other part, the part that had always been independent, always feared depending on someone else, wondered if maybe it was time to let her go. It was late afternoon when I found her standing at the edge of the field, gazing out at the horizon. I had been avoiding this conversation, but I knew it was time. There were no more distractions. The farm was still, the animals were fed, and the sky was slowly turning orange as the sun began to set. This was the moment we couldn't delay anymore. I walked over to her slowly, my feet crunching in the grass beneath me. When I reached her, I stopped, standing beside her, but not saying anything at first. We both just stood there, silent, the weight of the unspoken words hanging heavy between us. You know, don't you? Tessa's voice broke the silence, softer than I expected. That I can't stay here forever. I didn't know how to answer that. Part of me wanted to say yes, to tell her that I understood, that I would let her go, even if it broke me to do so. But the other part, the part that still clung to hope, wanted to beg her to stay, to tell her we could figure this out together. I don't want to lose you, I said quietly, my voice trembling in spite of myself. But I can't keep holding on if you're not sure. I need to know if you want to be here. With me. With us. Tessa turned to face me, her eyes sad but determined. I don't know if I can give you that certainty. But I think I need to find out what it feels like to be on my own for a while. To really know who I am without all the baggage. Without the past weighing me down. Her words stung more than I had anticipated. But at the same time, I knew they were true. She had been carrying the weight of the past for too long, and maybe she needed space to breathe, to find herself outside of the farm, outside of the life we had built. There was a long pause. I could feel my chest tightening, my hands trembling slightly as I fought to keep my composure. But this was it. The moment where everything shifted, where I had to decide whether I was going to cling to the past or whether I was going to let go, to give Tessa the space she needed, even if it meant losing her. I turned to face the horizon, taking in the beautiful expanse of the fields, the sun dipping low behind the distant hills. It was peaceful out here. There was a quiet stillness in the air, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my decision. You don't have to stay for me, Tessa, I said, my voice low and steady now, even if my heart was breaking inside. I want you to go if that's what you need. If that's what will make you happy. Her expression softened. She reached out, placing a hand gently on my arm. I don't know what will make me happy yet, but I have to find out. And maybe you need to, too. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over me like a blanket. It was true. We both needed to find ourselves again. We needed to heal, to grow, apart as much as together. As the conversation settled into a quieter space, we turned back to the barn, where the foal was nibbling on some fresh hay beside Willow. It was a comforting sight, a reminder that life was moving forward, that despite everything, there was still hope. The foal had made it. It was still standing. It was still fighting. Tessa and I watched the foal for a moment before I spoke again, this time with a sense of acceptance. Maybe it's time we learn from it, I said. The foal had to fight to get here. And so do we. But that doesn't mean we're alone. Tessa smiled at me then, her eyes brightening just a little.
No.
We're not alone. We never were. That evening, Tessa left. She didn't say goodbye in the way I expected. It wasn't dramatic or painful. It was simple, a hug, a kiss on the cheek, and the promise to visit. I watched her walk down the long path leading away from the barn, towards the horizon, as the sun disappeared completely, leaving the sky filled with stars. I didn't feel sadness, not the way I had imagined. I felt peaceful. We had done what we could. And now, we had to give each other space to breathe, to heal. And I knew, with a quiet certainty, that this wasn't the end. We would both come back, maybe stronger, maybe wiser, but certainly ready to live our own lives, no longer defined by the ghosts of the past.